Our Old Testament reading is from Exodus chapter 17. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of Israelites journeyed by stages, as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people then quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" This is the word of the Lord.
We call it the Enlightenment. It was 17th and 18th century when names like Descartes, Rousseau, Voltaire came into vogue. Building on the burgeoning advances in science, they shed the appeal to spiritual authorities to answer questions of human existence. I mean, with the growing knowledge of the physical world that came from science, the idea was that we can figure things out for ourselves, actually, and this led to a kind of disenchantment about the world. Instead of thinking about the world as being filled with God and the angels, out of sight but never out of hand, we began to think of the world as a place that was always subject to our own hands and the answers in our hands. And this has led to a kind of problem of God for everyone who has lived after the Enlightenment. Even true believers are at the same time secret skeptics, right? I mean, we continue to have a sense of God-hauntedness about our lives, especially if you go to church. Read the Bible, pray, study with others, and engage with those who lived in the enchanted age, who thought of the world that way. But increasingly, we are daily taught to use secular reasoning to make our way in the world. During the season of Lent, those of us who engage deeply in this challenge of following Jesus to the cross, we come to the conclusion that maybe our way isn't the way to life after all. That we realize that our way only leaves us in the end high and dry. Only a way other than our own can save us, a way that brings us living water that will slake our thirsts now and forever. Which leads us to our story from Exodus today. The children of Israel are journeying through the wilderness toward the promised land. Could we pause here for just a moment and ask this question? Have you ever asked this question? Why do we always call them children of Israel? I mean, I know technically the answer to that is that they were the near descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and so they are children of Israel. Remember that his children ended up in Egypt, and over a course of a stretch of about 400 years, they became enslaved there, and then God delivered them from Egypt by God's mighty hand and brought them through the sea and promised them a land in the future, and now they are journeying through the wilderness of Sin. Thank you for saying Sin and not sin, though it's spelled that way, but I suppose their grumbling would qualify for that too. But just how long do they have to remain children of Israel? When do they get to start adulting in their faith? You know? When for any of us? In one sense, it's a good thing to think of ourselves that way because it might mean that we have the sense enough to realize that we have still yet much to learn. And yet, will we ever learn? I mean, will we ever grow up enough to have learned from our experiences in life so that we don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again? I mean, I would hope that we Christians, who also consider ourselves children of Israel, children of God better, could make some progress spiritually at some point so that we could actually learn to trust in God based upon our experiences, right? And find the living water that is a gift from God through every desert we journey in life. In some ways, we might wonder why the children of Israel hadn't learned to trust in God's provision by this time in the story. I mean, they had just been delivered from Egypt and the oppressive whip of the overlords there, right? They had just gone through the sea by the mighty hand of God. Waters parted through the sea. They had just tasted to see that the Lord is good by the miraculous gift of manna in the wilderness. And so shouldn't they have mounted up enough evidence of faith in their own lives that by now, when they thirst, surely they know God will come through for them again, right? Apparently not. They are still children in their faith, and they are still operating at a level more of fear than faith. As different as we think our way of looking at the world now is, they were not so different from us as we think. They too looked at the circumstances of their life and they failed to imagine God being there in their midst in the moment of their thirst. So they complain to Moses. They want him to give them something to drink. They appeal to a human leader, not to God. They actually accuse him of ruining their lives. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Only to kill us and our children and our livestock from thirst? Think about this. They don't appeal directly to God. They appeal to Moses. Of course, they're really complaining about God, but in the midst of their thirst, they look only as far as their eyes can see. They are looking for political solutions, worldly answers to their problems. Even in their pre-enlightened minds, they are still just human beings who, in the midst of crisis situations, think that the only chance of hope and help is in the past, what they have known. The late writer John Updike summarized the human condition in every age this way. An old world is collapsing, and a new world is rising. We have better eyes for the collapse than for the rise, for the old one is the world we knew. And isn't that true? Faith lives on the promise of a new world rising. Fear feeds off the sense of loss of an old world collapsing. God had promised a land ahead that is flowing with milk and honey, but all they can see in the condition of their thirst is the glory of Egypt behind them. They long for what is lost because at least it was familiar. This is the situation of the American church today. We tend to idolize the way things used to be back in the, say it with me, good old days, right? Yeah. Back when the church seemed to rule the culture, back when the pews were filled with people, even on spring break, back when the plates were filled with plenty, back when it seemed that things were stable and not changing so fast, back when we felt like we were powerful and could control life in the public square, back when everyone knew their place. And if they were a little bit different, they knew to conform to the way the majority operated just to make sure we keep everything in order. Nowadays, many in the church feel like we're on the sidelines, like our voice and influence are waning, like somehow secularism is taking over, and we can't pray in our schools anymore, and we can't dictate who can love whom, and we can't decide who can marry we can't even keep people married by the stigma of divorce anymore. And for heaven's sake, we can't even enforce what bathrooms people use. But is this the real crisis we're dealing with in the church? I mean, is it really a test of God, or is it God's test of us? Think about this. Frederick Buechner talks about the craving for salt of people who are dying of thirst, looking for the wrong way to quench your thirst, a way that will just keep you thirsty. Learning from the children of Israel, I would say our thirst should send us into a deeper appeal to God, not to try to find solutions about how we can better manage our world and arrange things to make us more comfortable. In times like these, we should remember that we are all of us frail children of dust and feeble as frail, as we sang earlier. And appeal to God, who is the great giver of life to us. Moses goes straight to God. He doesn't pretend that he has led the people out of Egypt or gave them manna to eat. He appeals to God as he should. And in doing so, he acknowledges his own vulnerability before God. God, if you don't do something, these people are going to stone me. So God does something. God first tells Moses to go out ahead of the people. Ahead. Get it? Ahead, not behind. Go ahead of them. Go right to where the fear is, not to that false sense of security that is behind. This is what real spiritual leadership is. Leaders go to God and then go ahead of the people when the people want to go back. They call on the people to imagine a new world they have not yet lived in yet. They call for the people to imagine the new world that is rising and to be open to it. They call upon the people to trust in a God who wants to satisfy every hunger and thirst, and not just for us, but for all kinds of people everywhere. Jürgen Moltmann is arguably the most important theologian of the last half century. He is often called the theologian of hope. And Moltmann likes to say that the proper mode of God's being is the future. While all of us yearn for the past or try to live in the moment, God is always just out ahead of us, calling us onward, knowing that God is preparing a world for us that we cannot yet imagine, but we can trust. A world where there is water enough for every thirst to be quenched. So Moses goes ahead and takes some key leaders with him. And God tells him to go ahead to the rock at Horeb, and that God will be there waiting for him. Take that staff too, the one that you use to strike the Nile, and of course also the Red Sea, and use that staff because it's tried and true. I'll show you how this works. Again, this time, it's not just the waters that are parted to prevent death and give you life. It will be waters that come flowing, living waters, to give you life. Now, Moses was worried that the people were going to stone him, so God says in effect, and isn't this just like God, don't you know? Go find then the biggest stone you can find up ahead, and from it you will find the life I want to give you instead of the death the people want to deal you. Go find the thing you most fear. And by tapping that very thing, you will tap into the very source of life that will quench your thirst and the people's forever. Instead of avoiding those things that represent death to us, embrace them. Instead of avoiding the cross, pick it up. Jesus is Israel personified, and he takes up his cross. And by his obedience, he changes that on which people could only see death and transforms it into a source of life. He becomes for us the living water that by our drinking deeply of him quenches our thirst now and forever. But up till now in the sermon, I've been using water and the thirst for it as a metaphor, right, for something deeper spiritually. Most of us today, and it's important I do this because most of us in this room, if we're thirsty, we turn on the tap, right? We go to the kitchen faucet and there we have, just tap it and it's clean, safe water to satisfy our thirst. Not true for still 1.8 billion people on this planet who cannot find clean, safe drinking water. To spiritualize thirst for them is unspiritual. My friend Colleen Burrows grew up as a missionary kid in the African country of Malawi. She and her husband, David, founded 25 years ago what's called passport camps, and thousands of children and youth have attended these summer camps through this past quarter of a century, including our own kids who go to preteen camp every summer. But one of the beautiful things about these camps, the wrinkle to them that's different from the way many of us grew up, is that in every one of these camps there is a mission component, because the Burrows have a deep conviction that it is not just the spiritual life of our kids that matters, but it is also the physical as well as spiritual lives of children and others all over the world that matters, and they want to create not only a heart for God, but a heart for others. Love that. Bravo, brava, both. Colleen has gone back to Malawi many times and become alarmed at the conditions of children and their families having no access to clean water. Every 15 seconds, a child dies around the globe due to drinking water that makes them sick. They die from preventable, curable, and avoidable diseases. So Colleen started a ministry called Watering Malawi. They place wells in specific regions of Malawi where cyclical droughts have hit the hardest. They build wells near schools and orphanages. They provide deep borehead wells, hand washing stations in schools. They provide water catchment systems and solar-powered pumps. And every well is attached to a mother's club. I love this part, which involves 15 women of childbearing age who are made owners and caretakers of the well. They are trained in the maintenance of the wells, gardening techniques, nutrition, and child growth monitoring. How about that? Here's the thing. It's a good thing for us to read this passage and to think about all the kinds of thirst spiritually that we need quenched. It's another thing to think about the actual thirst of people in the world that need to be quenched. And maybe it's also important for us to become Moses for them, right? To join with ministries like this, to see to it that their thirst is quenched physically and then maybe spiritually because they sense that God has provided for them. We can go tap the rocks in the desert and hardened places and bring hope and maybe even faith to the thirsty. And that too would be a way other than our own. Amen.